My parents are both agriculturists from Bangladesh, and we came here when I was just 5 years old. You know, they love to work in the garden, they love nature, they love this sort of thing. And growing up, I instead ended up preferring space and space exploration and going to other planets and that sort of thing. So it's always been a bit of a tension point as to the sort of two halves of my upbringing and myself and that kind of thing. And yeah, from that perspective, when I was about 12 years old, I realized that there was actually a very easy way to combine these, which was that if we want human society to keep growing, we ultimately need to expand to the stars, essentially, to other planets, to the asteroids, to the moons of Jupiter, etc., etc., and ideally someday to other star systems. So specifically, I was studying aerospace engineering, unsurprisingly, and as I was finishing my degree, I knew I wanted to work in the space industry in Australia. But back in 2015, when this was when I just finished my studies, the space industry in Australia wasn't much of a thing. We didn't even have a space agency at that point, and there was not even the barest rumblings of that existing anytime soon. So the options were basically either to do a PhD or to do my own startup, right? Sort of build the industry myself. So from with my optimism at the time, I tried to do both at the same time. And let's just say that was probably not super wise, but in the end, I was able to put the PhD on hold and then focus on the startup more fully. But it was really the books that sort of informed my viewpoints on how we could, actually expand as a species to the rest of the solar system and then to other stars, and really the necessity of doing it. So essentially, the thought was, we need to go to other planets. SpaceX is already kind of doing this. So what can we do in the meantime to help this process happen? One of these, of course, is be a customer of SpaceX's and try and launch satellites, and therefore indirectly give them money. And in that process, I thought, what's a good use case for satellites? And Earth observation made quite natural sense considering my upbringing. The Earth is unfortunately being quite heavily, I'm not sure the right say abused here, by humanity, with problems such as climate change and deforestation and pollution and these sorts of things. And there's a lot of people hurting people as well with the wars that are happening. A lot of Earth observation use cases in Ukraine. So really very important to keep advancing with Earth observation technologies. So I figured that I could do a company in Earth observation. It made sense to me both from a technical and a business perspective, as well as from a societal perspective. So from that point, it was really a question of, what is the ultimate point we can reach with Earth observation? And I thought that could be, for example, sort of like a live stream of the entire Earth's surface, updating constantly. We have Google Earth that will update every year or so, maybe every 6 months at most in some areas. Some aerial imaging companies will image monthly. Satellites such as Sentinel or Landsat will image every few days. Planet can get down to daily. And in some cases you can get down to better than daily if you have enough satellites. But really, as far as I'm seeing, no one had really been planning that sort of, the ultimate in Earth observation, which really is that just continuous, persistent observation all the time. And it's just insane once you have that application, once you have that technology happening. It's just insane what sort of applications you could pull out of it. It's almost like putting the power of the US military's surveillance systems into the hands of the everyday people. That's really, I think, the ultimate point in Earth observation. And so I figured, what could we do to reach that point without having to launch as many satellites? And what could we actually do with that, with the technologies that would get us closer to that point? And one of the areas was that satellite imaging is usually not really done over the oceans because there's usually no customers out there, right? So there's really no point taking an image, putting it in your archive, and you won't be able to sell it, most likely. But if you were able to know, if you were able to image the oceans, and you were able to process the images in order to locate ships, You could, for example, start tracking things like illegal fishing, piracy, people smuggling, pollution, these sorts of things. So this was an area that we started to look quite closely in. Developed some AI algorithms, started to design a satellite that would actually be capable of monitoring the oceans. Realized such a satellite would not be able to do so unless it had either a ridiculous amount of bandwidth available, or just many ground stations spaced out all over the oceans essentially, or if it had some sort of ability on board the satellite to be able to process images as it captured them. Because really, again, the oceans are so large, and the amount of bandwidth available to satellites is so small that you really have to be very smart in terms of what you bring down. Usually, what is actually brought down is only, often less than 5%, in many cases less than 1% of what a satellite is able to capture. So really, these are assets that are, hundreds of millions of dollars of assets are being put up that are only being used 1% of the time. So, yeah, and because of this, it leads to market distortions. It leads to high prices. I was just on a call last night with a customer. He has a project where they needed to capture about 10,000 square kilometers of satellite imagery. But they only needed 600 square kilometers of that because they're not capable of clipping down to the areas that are actually needed. They have to capture the much broader areas using the satellites. And as a result, he paid 20 times as much as he actually needed to for that project. Yeah, it's definitely a cheaper solution because we're able to reduce those costs of, well, running the satellite really per unit of output. Really, it's like saying if you have a piece of infrastructure that costs $1 million, and you have you took a loan out against it, and that loan will be paid off in 10 years, and over that time you have to pay off, say, $150,000 worth of repayments. You better be making more than $150,000 on that piece of infrastructure. And if it can only produce 1,000 units of output, that each output will have to be priced at least $150 per unit, right? But if you can increase that to 100,000 units of output, then suddenly you can price it much cheaper, and really achieve prices that are much more affordable to really everyday people. And again, calling on my background, being from originally Bangladesh, we go back every couple of years, and we go and visit the family village and other areas of Bangladesh where people are taking probably areas the size of your house, Rob, and turning those into productive assets by growing rice, growing other crops, and having animals. And it's actually ridiculous how they can do so much with such a little area and then be able to live off that area, off that land. And really, but despite all this, despite what they're doing, and despite the best efforts from the government in Bangladesh, they're still stuck in poverty. And so, really, part of what we are looking to do is, if we can make this data as cheap as possible, as accessible as possible, we really want to be helping people as disconnected from the rest of technological society as marginal farmers in countries, developing countries like Bangladesh. Yeah, so the end user is ultimately going to be groups such as the farmer, or in some cases, larger companies or larger government agencies, depending again who is actually using that insight that we are delivering. So in agriculture, that may be a set of indexes on the health of crops. In maritime, it could be positions of ships and potential sightings of suspicious vessels. So that would obviously go to government agencies and defense agencies. In some cases, that may actually even ultimately ends up in the hands of commercial shipping companies through platforms such as, for example, Starboard is a company in New Zealand. Obviously, marinetraffic.com is a popular one as well. So, but ultimately, we do see us working with, as I alluded to, with partners such as these companies that are very vertically focused. Because we see that our technology has a lot of different applications, and we don't necessarily want to try to nail all of them, because I don't think that's possible. I think it's much better to focus on channel partners for each different vertical, and then serve really the basic needs that they have, and try to get them the insights that they need to serve their customers in a cheaper, faster, and more accessible manner. Yeah, so with the hardware that we are putting on board satellites, we need to have the ability to actually process imagery. And in many cases, especially for things like ship detection or forest mapping, water body mapping, or even land use mapping in some cases, or building footprint mapping, there's really a need to be able to segment the image as per different segments, and be able to classify what each segment is. So, for example, for ship detection, it's classifying each pixel as ship or not ship, and I can share some images on what this will look like. And for forest mapping, again, it's like forest, not forest. For building, building, not building. Sort of like the classic cat, not cat. But instead of classifying it at the full image level, we're able to actually segment the image so you can actually see what parts of the image are actually making up that object of interest. So from that, so we call that semantic segmentation. That's a bit more complex than the usual detection, which is just putting a box around the object of interest. And we're actually quite proud to say that we've managed to reduce the size of semantic segmentation algorithms by a factor of about 50. And what this actually means is this is the difference in being able to upload a new algorithm to hit a new use case within a day or a couple of days versus what could otherwise take weeks or months to upload. We're actually on 3 satellites. Yeah. The first couple was sort of not successful. The third one is slightly less unsuccessful, if you know what I mean. But we're starting to get some data from it that show our payload is at least healthy, and we're hoping to get that recovered in the next couple of months, hopefully. So we have some opportunities to fly our software on board other satellites, so that'll be exciting. But most excitingly, we've got a full, and this will be an actual operational mission if all goes well, with Satellogic. So that will be capturing very high resolution imagery, and we'll be able to process it on board and do things like ship detection and forest mapping and other things like this. So that's going to be pretty interesting, and we're quite keen to put that into the hands of customers. But in addition to that, we intend to be actually creating a platform for companies and even enthusiasts to write software, put it into space, and test it in space in as easy a manner as possible. So we've already got probably 5 to 10 different companies that are testing their software on board our little ground test bed, which we have in the office. Not in the office at the moment, of course, but we've got a little space age computer connected to the internet, and anyone that's interested, we can actually give the credentials to log into that and start developing in the exact environment that will be going to space. So that's more of a midterm opportunity, and the way we see that happening is we will develop some of the more broader use cases, things like ship detection, very broad and very not very custom necessarily. But there may be custom use cases, for example, where someone might be looking for a specific type of vessel, or in agriculture they might say that, the analysis that probably does is good for, let's say, grains, but it's not really any good for fruits. And I care specifically about apples, so I'm going to make an algorithm specifically to look at the health of apple trees, for example. And so they will be able to upload that algorithm to a space age computer, run it, pay really a per use fee to run the processing, similar to AWS or Microsoft Azure, and then from there get the insights that they need for their business or their use case. And even beyond that, there's actually an opportunity that someone might be able to say, well, I need my apple trees looked at, but I don't necessarily know how to develop the algorithm myself. Oh, and Spiral Blue doesn't have an algorithm themselves either, but actually look at that. There's someone else that was monitoring apple trees, and their algorithm is available, or their app is available through Spiral Blue. Maybe I can ask them to analyze my area of interest. So it's almost starting to turn into an app store type environment. That's really a really long-term plan. So definitely a lot of pressure from my parents, as you can imagine, being from a South Asian family. Very traditional, very expected that you do your PhD, then you get a good job, then you get married, then you have kids, then you buy a house at some point in the middle there, right? So that's the traditional approach, and so the worry always was how does doing a startup help me get to that point? That's what my parents were always worried about. But despite all this, I was able to demonstrate to them that Spiral Blue was actually creating something of value, and we were able to I was actually able to get my first funding from my parents, which I'm very very proud to be able to say that without their support this would not have been possible. And so I was able to get our first funding from them, managed to get that matched with a government grant as well from the New South Wales state government, and that's actually what helped us build and start building our first prototype to be launched. So that was really fantastic. And then, of course, things got a lot simpler when we got our first defense contract. So that, if for any American viewers, you may be familiar with the Small Business Innovation Research contracts, which are available from a lot of, I think every US government agency is required to provide them for any good ideas that they see out there. So Australian Defence has a similar program called Defence Innovation Hub, and so we were able to tap into that and get a fair chunk of funding to develop Vessel Detect from really almost like a hobby project to something that, as I said, is 50 times more lightweight than what is currently out there. So that really helped, and since then we've sort of been in this spiral, if you will, of new grants and new investor funding and these sort of things happening, and trying to do launches and developing our technology and these sorts of things. And I've been quite happy to be able to say that I've been able to draw a salary in this time, so that's put my parents' worries at rest. I'm actually proud to say that we have hired my dad as a natural sciences expert. So he did a lot of a long career, and he was quite happy to take sort of an early retirement. But then after a couple of years, he got bored. Basically said, why don't you come on board and we can do some work together. And yeah, through that process, he's recognized that there's a lot that he can learn from us. But likewise, we've recognized as space people and as software people, as engineers, there's a lot that we can learn from him and his experience in agriculture, environmental sciences, as well as in business as well. So that's been fantastic. I think the learning curve has been interesting. When I originally started out in 2015, I thought that I could come up with some ideas, and I probably wouldn't be able to do the business side of things. I'd probably have to be a chief technical officer or something, and find some sort of business-minded person to be the CEO. Uh, let's just say I've had to fashion myself into a CEO and less of a CTO. It's very rare nowadays that I actually get to do technical work. I think the most technical work I've been doing recently is requirements engineering, which is still very business oriented. So it's been quite interesting from that front. I think the biggest challenge has probably been building a strong team. I started really thinking about Spiral Blue in late 2017. It was only in mid 2018 that I found my first co-founder, Dr. Henry Zong, and then late 2019 when I found my now CTO and co-founder James Buttonshaw. So it's really a process of multiple years to develop the idea, excite people about it, and then be able to bring them on. And let's just say in this time, there's been a lot of people I've talked to who I've tried to get involved, who have not really been that interested, but they seemed interested at the time, but they kind of dropped out. So that's honestly been quite a struggle. Obviously, if once we had that funding, it was obviously easier to just hire people on salaries. But even then, getting the right people is probably the biggest challenge. A high point has definitely been when we get confirmation that we're winning some grant or contract, especially if it's a big one. Been a big high point. I've gone and hugged the parents whenever that's happened. So that's been fantastic. Really awesome when we get to watch a launch happen. So we actually did a live stream for the first launch that we had in July, or sorry, end of June last year. Unfortunately, that the satellites, while the satellites were not successful, watching the launch itself with the Virgin Orbit rocket, dropped from a plane, that was very exciting, and I think a lot of people really enjoyed that, myself included. Unfortunately, the second launch we had, which was with SpaceX, was happening while I was on a plane, and I only found out about the launch a week before it was supposed to happen because we weren't sure what the schedule would be for it. So we weren't able to do an event or a live stream proper for it, but still very exciting to land and then see like, yep, it's taken off properly and everything's normal so far. So that's. I think the underappreciated things that happen in startups is just being able to bounce off one's team. Like, it's always great to have that, really high highs of, you're winning, you're getting money, you're doing launches and this kind of thing. But I think it's really important to have a really good team that you can bounce off and just maintain, good motivation and good energy levels. And I think I've been very lucky with the people that I have found so far. But yeah, certainly we need to keep going on that front. In terms of low points, there's been many points where I've thought, is this working out? Things are being delayed, things are not happening as we expected. Should we just, we had some investment, should we just give it back? This sort of stuff does sometimes come to one's mind, right? And in those situations, I think what really helps is just being really honest with everyone, especially my co-founders, and just say that, look, right now I'm struggling a bit. It might just maybe need. It may just be that I might need some rest. It may just be that we need to put some plans together or get some reassurances or that kind of thing. And so there have been very low points, but I'm happy to say that we've been able to recover quite quickly from those. What have I learned about myself? I think the most amazing thing is my personality has done a complete flip since I started to consider doing a company. I used to be very quiet, and I'm still, to be fair, I'm still a bit quieter than your typical extrovert, let's say. But it used to be that I would be very quiet. I wouldn't almost say anything at all, and I literally had to go out and read how to win friends and influence people by what was his name, Dan Carnegie or something like that. In order to understand how do I actually interact with people and be able to develop relationships in business as well as in personal life. So that was pretty funny. But then I was very fortunate to have been selected as a chief technical officer in a student society in 2015. And so through that, I was able to interact with people, lead projects, interact with academia as well, and that sort of thing. And through that, start to develop that ability to actually do business almost in a way and do project management. And since then, it's almost been on the up and up. I think advice would I give? I think the initial money that you can get to start building something is so important. I had some savings initially that I was able to use to start buying hardware. Obviously, I was able to get my parents invested as well, and that made such a huge difference from going from someone with just Google Sheets slide or Google Slides or PowerPoint slides and some ideas and some engineering mock-ups and that kind of thing to someone with actual real hardware who was able to show off like, yes, this is what we're building. It's gonna work. We're gonna fly it. And even the point where we actually booked a launch and we were able to say that yes, we are planning to fly, that immediately changed a lot of minds in people. Like, oh, okay, so this is actually going to happen. Of course, people were waiting to see it happen, and then it did happen, and since then it's been even better. And ultimately, it'll get better again once we actually do show our system fully operational in orbit. But in this time, really just starting out, it's so important to build trust, to build credibility as quickly as possible. And unfortunately, a bit of that does require a bit of spending money. So as a younger person, it's often quite hard to save money. There's a lot of expenses. So it's very important to have a good relationship with family and friends, so that you can recruit them and maybe. I never recommend getting loans from people. I would always say structure it as an equity arrangement, that they are investing in your company, and make them 100% aware that yes, this is money that you are giving me that you will most likely never see again. Right? I think that it is very important to make that clear, to set the expectations in that way. And of course, I would recommend participating in as many startup programs and courses and accelerators and incubators and ideators and all the various terms that they have for these sorts of things nowadays. I would highly recommend. I think before we got our defense contract, I probably did 5 or 6 of these. So yeah, highly recommend. And guess what? We're still doing them. I'm in about 3 at the moment. One focused more broadly on the business, one focused on how to export to the US, and one more focused on exporting to the UK. Right. So I think it's something that you just always have to keep doing, no matter what point you reach. You know, I'd say it's in terms in terms of having the time and in terms of having the energy to go out and try things and not having necessarily a huge a mortgage or a family to look after. It's definitely been a huge boon for me, and I've been able to take risks that would not have been possible for myself if I was older. But conversely, because I am younger, and this is generally unsaid, no one generally says this to my face, but people see that I have the technical skills and I'm developing the business skills to run this business. But people also accept that this is the first time he's doing it. He doesn't have 10 years of working in a company or in other startups or something like that, or for government, to be able to have those connections. And that experience to be able to say that yes, this person actually definitely has the experience to do this. And certainly I don't have often you'll see startups, especially in space, the CEO and CTO will have various NASA or ESA or Lockheed or Boeing or SpaceX in their pitch decks, right? Because they have worked there, and that's really great to have. So not having that experience, because frankly it's not possible to go work for those sorts of organizations as an Australian, has definitely hindered. But conversely, Australia does have a very strong academic space, and that is generally globally recognized. And so that's why people, as soon as I was able to bring Dr. Henry Zong on board, people were very appreciative of that. And Henry is also a bit older, has some experience in software development and this sort of thing, so that does help. And then my CTO James, he's done probably 15 years, ever since high school, working for defense companies, initially as an aircraft mechanic, but then later doing his engineering degree and then becoming a systems engineer and then working more in defense and government and these sorts of organizations. So definitely he's very well recognized for his ability to manage projects and manage technical, highly technical projects, right? So I think the key as a younger person is to recognize that I don't need to be the smartest person at the company. I just have to be able to work with people who are much smarter than me and be able to excite them and keep them motivated and bring them on. And that's really helped.